Did you know that the Appalachian Trail, one of the longest and most famous hiking paths in the world, is also home to countless unsolved mysteries? From unexplained disappearances to eerie encounters deep in the woods, these are not just ghost stories. They're real events that have left even the most seasoned hikers questioning what truly lurks in the heart of those ancient mountains. First story: the nighttime follower. I had been hiking the Appalachian Trail for about 3 weeks when I noticed him. At first, I didn't think much of it. The trail's busy, and people often end up on the same schedule, crisscrossing each other at campsites or water sources. But this guy was different. No matter how fast or slow I hiked, he always seemed to be there, just out of sight, but close enough that I could feel his presence. One night, I camped at a small clearing, far from the usual spots. I wanted a quiet night, away from the bustle of the more popular campsites. It was just before dark when I set up my tent, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a sense of peace, until I heard the crunch of footsteps on the leaves. I froze, thinking it was just another hiker. But then I remembered, I was miles off the main trail. I hadn't seen a single person all day. The steps were deliberate, slow, like someone trying not to be heard. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay perfectly still, listening to the soft rustle of leaves. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I held my breath, my mind racing. There was no way out without making noise. Then, just as suddenly as they came, the footsteps began again, this time retreating back into the darkness. I didn't sleep at all that night, too terrified to move. The next morning, I packed up at first light and hiked the fastest 20 miles of my life, never looking back. I never saw him again, but to this day, I can't shake the feeling that he was watching, waiting. Story 2: the Lost Hunter. A few years ago, my friend Joe and I decided to do a section hike of the Appalachian Trail during hunting season. We figured the trail was well marked, and we'd be safe if we stuck to it. We were wrong. On the third day, we heard gunshots in the distance. It wasn't unusual, but the shots kept getting closer. We started to get uneasy. That night, we set up camp far off the trail to avoid any accidental encounters. Around midnight, we heard rustling in the woods. Not the kind of rustling animals make. This was heavy, like someone was stomping through the brush. We whispered to each other, deciding it was probably another hunter. But then we heard a low mumble. It was a man's voice, but we couldn't make out what he was saying. Joe called out, "Hey, you all right out there?" But there was no response. The rustling stopped. For a moment, it was dead silent. Then, the man's voice started up again, closer this time. He sounded disoriented, almost frantic. We grabbed our knives, the only weapons we had, and prepared for the worst. Finally, the man emerged from the darkness, stumbling into our camp. His eyes were wild, and he was covered in dirt and scratches. He told us he was a hunter who had gotten lost days ago. His buddies never found him, and he had been wandering without food or water, barely surviving. But here's the thing. When we radioed for help, no one reported a missing hunter. And when the rangers showed up, they didn't find his campsite, his gear, or any sign that he'd been there. The guy vanished just as quickly as he appeared. Joe and I got out of there fast, and to this day, I wonder if he really was a lost hunter or something else entirely. Story 3: the abandoned campsite. I was hiking alone, doing a solo stretch through the more remote parts of the trail. One afternoon, as the sun was starting to set, I came across an abandoned campsite. The fire pit was cold, but it looked like whoever had been there left in a hurry. There was a tent, half collapsed, and gear scattered around like someone just grabbed what they could and bolted. I called out, but there was no answer. I should have kept moving, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked over to the tent and saw that it was torn, like it had been ripped open from the inside. Clothes and food were strewn everywhere, but there were no signs of a struggle. No blood, no footprints leading away, nothing. I started feeling uneasy, like I was being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I had this overwhelming urge to leave, fast. As I turned to go, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A notebook, half buried under some leaves near the tent. I picked it up and flipped through it. It was a journal, filled with frantic, almost incoherent entries about someone, or something, following the writer. The last entry was just a single line. "It's right outside." I dropped the notebook and ran. I didn't stop until I was miles away. To this day, I don't know what happened to the person who left that campsite, and I never went back to that part of the trail again. Story 4. The Unseen Pursuer. My buddy and I were hiking the Appalachian Trail during the summer, tackling a section that was notorious for its dense forests. The trees were so thick in some parts that it felt like night even during the day. We were 2 days in when we started hearing it. Footsteps behind us, crunching leaves, snapping twigs. At first, we figured it was just another hiker, but no one ever appeared. We'd stop, and the footsteps would stop too. We'd pick up the pace, and so would they. It was unnerving, but we tried to laugh it off. By the third day, it wasn't funny anymore. We were genuinely spooked, constantly looking over our shoulders, but never seeing anything. That night, we made camp early, exhausted from the anxiety of being followed. We didn't even bother with a fire, just crawled into our tents and tried to sleep. I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of someone, breathing just outside my tent. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to stay still, hoping it would go away. Then, my tent started to shake, like someone was brushing against it. I held my breath, gripping my knife, waiting for something to happen. The shaking stopped, but the breathing continued, this low, raspy sound that seemed to go on forever. Then, just as suddenly, it was gone. When I finally worked up the courage to peek outside, there was nothing there. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. My friend had heard it too, but like me, he was too scared to move. We packed up at first light and hiked out without saying a word. Whatever was out there, it didn't follow us after that, but I'll never forget the sound of that breathing. Story 5. The Vanishing Hiker. Years ago, I met this guy on the trail, an older hiker named Tom. He was a seasoned backpacker and had been hiking the Appalachian Trail for decades. We ended up sharing a campsite one night, and as we sat around the fire, he told me about something that had happened to him years earlier, something that still haunted him. Tom was hiking a remote section of the trail when he met a young hiker going the opposite direction. They exchanged the usual pleasantries, and the guy seemed normal enough, if a bit skittish. He asked Tom if he had seen any other hikers, which was odd because this section of the trail was pretty deserted. Tom said no, and the guy just nodded, looking relieved, and continued on his way. A few days later, Tom reached a small trail town and mentioned the encounter to some locals. Their faces went pale. They told him that the hiker he described had gone missing a week earlier, but there was no way he could have still been on the trail. His body had been found miles away, deep in the woods, days before Tom saw him. Tom swore up and down that he had seen the guy, talked to him, even described the clothes he was wearing. But the locals insisted it was impossible. Tom didn't know what to think. Maybe it was a case of mistaken identity, or maybe the guy had a twin, but there was one detail that Tom couldn't shake. When he met the hiker, he had noticed a strange smell, like decay, but had brushed it off as just the scent of the woods. Now, he wasn't so sure. Tom ended his story by saying that he stopped hiking that section of the trail after that. Said it never felt the same, like something was watching him, waiting. I laughed it off at the time, but now, every time I'm on the trail, I can't help but wonder, what if it was something more than just a mistaken identity? Story 6. The Hidden Cabin. A few years back, I decided to hike a lesser-known section of the Appalachian Trail, one that wound through some of the most remote areas in the Smoky Mountains. It was the kind of place where you could go days without seeing another soul. On the third day, as I was making my way up a particularly steep incline, I spotted something unusual through the trees. A small, weathered cabin, half hidden by the thick undergrowth. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check it out. The cabin looked ancient, with rotting wood and a collapsed roof. But what struck me as odd was how there was no clear path leading to it. No signs that anyone had been there in years. The door was hanging open, creaking slightly in the breeze. I hesitated at the threshold, peering inside. The interior was dark, damp, and cluttered with broken furniture. But one thing stood out immediately. a stack of old, yellowed papers scattered across the floor. I picked one up and quickly realized it was a journal, though the writing was barely legible. The entries I could make out were bizarre, filled with paranoid ramblings about them, watching from the woods, listening, waiting. The final entry chilled me to the bone. They found me. I don't have much time. If you find this, don't stay. Suddenly, I felt like I was being watched, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I backed out of the cabin, heart racing, and practically ran back to the trail. I didn't stop until I was miles away, and even then, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. I've hiked many trails since, but I've never gone back to that section, and I never told anyone about the cabin. I'm not sure I'd believe it myself if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. Story 7. The Disappearing Supplies. Last fall, I was hiking the Appalachian Trail with two of my buddies. We were well-prepared, experienced hikers, and we knew the trail well. But on this trip, something strange kept happening. Our supplies started to disappear. It began with small things, a lighter here, a water bottle there. We figured we'd just misplaced them, though it was odd that all three of us were losing things. But then, more critical items started vanishing. Food from our bear bags, a headlamp, even one of our backpacks, which we found half empty and stuffed under a bush about 50 feet from our campsite. At first, we joked that one of us was sleepwalking, or maybe some animal had gotten unusually bold. But as it kept happening, we started to get paranoid. We began taking turns keeping watch at night, convinced that someone, or something, was messing with us. One night, as I sat on watch, I heard a faint rustling in the bushes. I tensed, gripping my flashlight, and slowly turned it on. The beam caught a glimpse of movement, a flash of something pale disappearing behind a tree. I called out to my friends, and we all scrambled out of our tents, searching the area. We found nothing. By the end of the trip, we were all on edge, exhausted from the lack of sleep and the constant fear that we were being watched. The last night, we decided to hike out in the dark, too unnerved to spend another night on the trail. As we packed up, we found a single piece of paper tucked into one of our tents, scrawled with the words, "Thanks for the supplies." We never figured out who or what was responsible, but none of us have hiked that part of the trail since. Story 8. The Silent Stranger. I was on the Appalachian Trail a few years ago, hiking solo through a particularly desolate stretch in Virginia. It was late afternoon, and I was looking for a place to set up camp when I saw him, an older man, standing on the trail about 50 yards ahead, just staring at me. I waved, trying to be friendly, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, watching me. Something about him felt off. Maybe it was the way he was dressed, in clothes that looked like they hadn't been changed in weeks, or the blank, almost vacant look in his eyes. I figured I'd just hike past him, but as I got closer, he stepped to the side of the trail, still not saying a word. I mumbled a quick, "hello," as I passed, but he didn't acknowledge me. It was unnerving, but I kept moving, wanting to put some distance between us before setting up camp. I found a decent spot about a mile down the trail, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept looking back over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man following me, but the trail behind me was empty. Still, I couldn't bring myself to relax. I ended up not setting up my tent, deciding to sleep under the stars so I could move quickly if I needed to. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a soft rustling nearby. I froze, listening. It was subtle, like someone trying to move quietly through the brush. My heart was pounding in my ears as I slowly reached for my knife, every instinct telling me not to make a sound. The rustling stopped, and for a long moment, there was silence. Then, from just beyond the circle of light from my headlamp, I heard a low, almost whispered voice. It was the man, and he said just one word, "Leave." I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my pack and hiked through the night, not stopping until I reached a busy section of the trail the next morning. I never saw the man again, but I'll never forget his voice or the look in his eyes. He meant it. Whatever he was, or whoever he thought I was, he didn't want me there. Story 9. The Bridge Incident. Several years ago, I was hiking with my girlfriend on the Appalachian Trail, and we came across an old, rickety bridge that crossed a small ravine. It wasn't marked on our map, but it was the only way forward without backtracking several miles. The bridge didn't look safe, but we decided to take the risk. I went first, stepping cautiously on the wooden planks. Some of them creaked and shifted under my weight, but I made it across without any problems. My girlfriend followed, but about halfway across, one of the boards snapped and her leg went through the bridge. She was okay, just a few scratches, but as I helped her up, I noticed something strange. Beneath the bridge, in the ravine, there was an old campsite, clearly abandoned, with a tent that had collapsed on itself and some rusty pots and pans scattered around. I helped her across the bridge, and we decided to check out the campsite. When we got down there, we found it had been abandoned for a long time, but what was eerie was the state of it. It looked like whoever had camped there had left in a hurry. The tent was torn, and there were personal items, clothes, a book, a half-full water bottle, left behind as if the person just vanished. But that wasn't the worst part. Scrawled on the side of the tent, in what looked like charcoal, were the words, "Don't look." We didn't stay to find out what it meant. We hiked out of that section as fast as we could, not stopping until we were far away from that bridge. To this day, I wonder who left that message and what they didn't want us to see. Last story. The marked trees. A couple of years ago, I was hiking a remote part of the Appalachian Trail in Maine. This area was dense with trees, the kind of place where it's easy to feel completely isolated. I was several days into my hike when I started noticing the trees. At first, it was just a few tall, old pines with strange markings carved into the bark. I thought maybe they were trail markers, but they didn't match any I'd seen before. The carvings were crude, almost like symbols or letters, but I couldn't make them out. As I continued, I saw more of them, each one more detailed than the last. They started to appear in clusters, and the closer I looked, the more unsettling they became. Some were fresh, with sap still oozing from the cuts, while others looked ancient, the carvings worn and faded. It wasn't until the fourth day that I realized the carvings were getting closer to the trail itself, and they all seemed to be pointing in the same direction, away from the trail, deeper into the woods. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the markings, venturing off the trail for the first time. After about a half-mile, I came across a small clearing. In the center, there was a single, massive tree, much older and larger than the others. Its bark was covered in the same symbols, but these were much more elaborate, almost ritualistic. The air was thick and oppressive, and the silence was absolute. Suddenly, I heard a sound behind me, footsteps, but when I turned, there was no one there. My heart was racing, and I felt a deep, primal fear that I couldn't explain. I backed out of the clearing slowly, not daring to turn my back on the tree, and practically ran back to the trail. Each of these stories reminds us that the Appalachian Trail, while beautiful and serene, harbors secrets that can unsettle even the most experienced hikers. These aren't just tales of the unknown. They're real events that leave a lasting impression, a reminder of the trail's more sinister side. Next time you plan to hike the Appalachian Trail, remember these stories. Prepare well, stay alert, and above all, trust your instincts, because out there, you never know what you might encounter.